This is your reality check.
Welcome to The Reality Check, the weekly Canadian show that explores a wide range of controversies and curiosities using science and critical thinking. Today is May 30th, 2020. I'm producer Pat, and with me is Cristina Roach.
Hey everyone.
As has been the case for many weeks now, Darren and Adam continue to record solo in isolation. We have three interesting segments for you today. Darren does a deep dive into conspiracy theories about Bill Gates, and Adam asks whether anime characters look white. But first, Cristina, what's going on with copper masks?
Pat and I were catching up on the news while eating breakfast a few days ago, and an ad came on CNN for copper face masks, and it just oozed infomercial BS to us, didn't it, Pat?
Totally, yeah.
We listened intently, expecting some bogus claims to come up, but although they lauded the greatness of this copper mask, they didn't actually make any claims about the copper specifically. So we were kind of puzzled by that, and it did beg the question, is there anything special about copper masks versus regular cloth masks? The Googling began, and it only took a few minutes to find many great articles published in the last few days. It seems like copper masks are an increasingly hot topic this week. The first article I dug into was a recent Fast Company piece by Elizabeth Seegren titled "Copper Masks Are the Latest Craze. Should You Buy One?" To be clear, the notion of copper destroying bacteria and viruses is not magic. It's well-documented science. We could do a whole show on the use of copper since ancient times. As Seegren sums up, copper contains positively charged ions that trap viruses that are negatively charged. The copper ions penetrate the viruses, stopping them from replicating. She goes on to cite a recent study published in the New England Journal of Medicine that found copper is effective at, quote, inactivating the novel coronavirus within 4 hours. Good to keep in mind this study was specific to aerosol and surface stability, not specifically about masks. Seegren's colleague, Mark Wilson, wrote an article back in March pointing out copper is a natural passive antimicrobial material. It can self-sterilize its surface without the need for electricity or bleach. And he cites research on a Department of Defense grant in 2015 that compared infection rates at 3 hospitals and found when copper alloys were used, it reduced infection rates by 58%. Now, another study at a pediatric ICU in 2016 also showed an impressive reduction in infection rate. Wilson quotes Bill Keevil, a professor at environmental healthcare at the University of Southampton, who says, "We've seen viruses just blow apart. They land on copper and it just degrades them." Leads me back to my question. Should we buy copper masks? Can we just buy any copper mask? No surprise, the answer's complicated. Michael Schmidt, a professor of microbiology and immunology at the Medical University of South Carolina, who studies copper use in medical products, says he has high hopes for copper masks. But, this is his quote, "There's a lot of research that still needs to be done about their effectiveness. If you're just throwing copper layers into a mask, we don't know if they work." And that's an issue considering the increasing trend of fabric masks infused with copper. Many retailers are making claims that their masks have antiviral properties without being able to back it up. Now, Dr. Phyllis Kuhn, a microbiologist at University of Massachusetts Amherst, notably invented a reusable mask made of 99.5% pure copper mesh called Well Masks. Highly recommend checking out the article I linked to in the show notes called "Copper Masks, a Hopeful Weapon Against COVID-19. It covers her extensive background in medical research and specifically the use of copper in masks. Now, Kuhn says the mask's copper mesh allows for, quote, a minuscule amount of copper to be deposited in the nasopharyngeal area, potentially killing viruses and stimulating an anti-inflammatory response without the use of drugs. And the article goes on to say, tests with inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry have confirmed copper's effect when deposited in the NP area. Since viruses can enter the body through the nostrils, this feature is particularly important. These masks are also water resistant, and that protects from germs that spread from sneezing. Her mask has design and provisional patents and pending utility patents, though as of this recording, the FDA in the US has not yet cleared them for public use. You can purchase them on her site, and Kuhn's plan, considering the interest from manufacturers, is to produce these masks on a larger scale so they're accessible to not only healthcare professionals, but consumers too. Back to Michael Schmidt, who I mentioned earlier. He told Today it could be a game changer if reputable, Emphasis on the word reputable. Retailers started ramping up on copper masks, adding that it may be effective enough to diminish a second wave. Medical director of the National Foundation for Infectious Disease in Maryland, though, Dr. William Schaffner, is air quotes dubious that copper masks are better than regular masks. In the same Today article, he acknowledges the antiviral properties of copper, but he's more concerned about getting way more people to wear them than the specific material used to make them. He points out studying a mask in a lab differs from wearing one in the real world, where it's hard to gauge the setting and what concentrations of virus could a copper mask kill. Good points.
Yeah. And one would think that a copper mask would be a more expensive item than a fabric mask, so that probably needs to be considered as well.
That is true. From what I've read and what I've seen, copper masks are definitely more expensive. So, should you buy a copper mask? As Schmidt told Fast Company, if a copper textile has been scientifically evaluated, it could be an improvement on the average cloth mask. The problem is that most copper masks on the market haven't been studied. Schmidt suggests that copper face masks made by Cupron are a good bet, as they're registered by the EPA and have been studied. The downside is they're only currently available for purchase by institutions. I double-checked their site, and a minimum order via Cupron is 1,000 masks. So circling back to the copper mask TV commercial I mentioned off the top that inspired this deep dive, my best guess is the ad did not make any claims about the superiority of their masks infused with copper because they couldn't.
Right.
I think they're leaning on the use of copper as a selling point because, science. Yet they obviously haven't put the research behind their product to be able to make any substantiated claims about their effectiveness. Schmidt stresses you should really do your homework if you intend to buy one and check whether a company has gone through the rigor of testing and getting their masks evaluated. Contact retailers. Ask if their mask has been validated before wasting any money. Otherwise, what you're getting is no better than a standard cloth face mask. Quick side note I wanted to mention because I found this really interesting. Schmidt said this in a couple of articles. U.S. quarters, nickels, and pennies contain antimicrobial copper. So if you're out of hand sanitizer, he says, grab a bunch of coins, shake them around your hand, and you can get rid of any possible virus or bacteria. He told Smithsonian Mag, you never know how many viruses are affiliated with the hand, so it may not completely get them all. No, it's a bit of a last resort type thing.
That's really counterintuitive because often we think about money as being very dirty.
Yes,
Yeah.
that you make a really good point too. And for us Canadians, we've eliminated use of the penny, and our current circulating nickels, dimes, and quarters are made from nickel-plated steel. But if you have pennies minted before 97, they're between 95% and 98% copper.
That's a really interesting conclusion because, as you say, my initial response to this copper mask thing was that it sounded like nonsense. And I think maybe it was a lot to do with how the commercial was filmed and presented.
Me too, I was skeptical. That's why it's important to dig deep and do your research, because I definitely learned something interesting about copper masks.
All right. Well, with that, we will throw things to Darren and Adam. Hope everyone out there is taking care in these strange times, and we will talk to you soon. And also wishing Darren a very happy birthday today.
Happy birthday, Superman. We love you.
Bill Gates has been attracting a lot of attention lately, some of which is negative and unfounded. Here at the show, we want to challenge what you read in the headlines and on social media, so I thought I would explore the question, is Bill Gates evil? Well, he didn't go to evil computer school for all those years for nothing, you know. More seriously, back in April, I was aware of some petition to have the Gates Foundation charged with crimes against humanity. And then last week, now about 2 weeks ago, something about the Italian government said Gates should be arrested. And then just a few days ago, that Gates will be using a COVID vaccine to implant a microchip in people? What's going on? I thought Gates was that guy that cared a lot about people dying from diarrhea and wanted to make a better toilet for the world. I'll evaluate some of the main claims because I think these are important to refute, even though it's tempting to not even give them any more attention. Internet beliefs tend to fester unless they are exposed for the nonsense they are. So there was a White House petition created on April 12th, 2020, with the title, "We Call for Investigations into the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for Medical Malpractice and Crimes Against Humanity." I'll give you the full text. As we look at events surrounding the COVID-19 pandemic, various questions remain unanswered. On October 18th of 2019, only weeks prior to Ground Zero being declared in Wuhan, China, two major events took place. One is Event 201. The other is the Military World Games, held in none other than Wuhan. Since then, a worldwide push for vaccines and biometric tracking has been initiated. These seem to be signals of sketchy events which may have led to people organizing about the virus. Nothing backs that up. At the forefront of this is Bill Gates, who has publicly stated his interest in, quote, reducing population growth, quote, by 10 to 15% by means of vaccination. Gates, UNICEF, and the World Health Organization have already been credibly accused of intentionally sterilizing Kenyan children through the use of hidden HCG antigen and tetanus vaccines. Congress and all their governing bodies are derelict in duty until a thorough and public inquiry is complete. Well, doesn't that sound alarming? Currently, this petition has about 575,000 e-signatures. Sounds like a lot. But let's think about that. With a population of about 328 million, that means about 0.15% of Americans signed it. Granted, some of those numbers would be babies which wouldn't sign it, but the point is that very few have actually signed it overall. Perhaps also they're Russian trolls. So in the interest of time, let's focus on the second part. Gates publicly stated his interest in reducing population growth by 10 to 15% by means of vaccines. Did he? Well, I googled and found a garbage website called From Rome, which doesn't sound at all as glamorous as being from Rome, that thinks it is outlandish that we want to lower carbon emissions. That's your first sign this isn't a great website. And they use a video from a TED Talk in 2011 about climate change and carbon. Gates was talking about the various variables at play, one of which is population. Gates said the world population is expected to reach about 9 billion, but that number could decrease if we do a really great job with new vaccines, healthcare, and reproductive health services. We could lower it by perhaps 10-15%. But what does that mean? Well, if you already believe Bill Gates is evil, you'll see this as a diabolical attempt at population control. Alternatively, if you happen to already know that if someone believes many of their children will die, that they tend to have more children, then you may think differently. If you have better healthcare, including vaccines for all sorts of illnesses not related to fertility, and you provide more reproductive health services, people will have fewer children, thus fewer people on Earth, thus reduced carbon footprint. Bill and Melinda Gates say so in their foundation's annual letter from 2017, and I found it mentioned on Snopes, linked in the show notes at trcpodcast.com. This is from Melinda. Saving children's lives is the goal that launched our global work. It's an end in itself. But then we learned it has all these other benefits as well. If parents believe their children will survive, and if they have the power to time and space their pregnancies, they choose to have fewer children. And this is from Bill. When a mother can choose how many children to have, her children are healthier, they're better nourished, their mental capacities are higher, and parents have more time and money to spend on each child's health and schooling. That's how families and countries get out of poverty. This link between saving lives, a lower birth rate, and ending poverty was the most important early lesson Melinda and I learned about global health. Now, to be fair, exactly how this works and how effective it is a bit debatable, but in general it does seem to be true that the more education and resources and the knowledge that their children won't die, the fewer children women have. And it may not generalize easily from one location to the next, but clearly the intention of the Gates Foundation here is to help people not subversively limit population growth. Alright, so the next line on that petition is Gates, UNICEF, and WHO, the World Health Organization, have already been credibly accused of intentionally sterilizing Kenyan children through the use of hidden HCG antigen and tetanus vaccines. Credibly accused is a delightful phrase, isn't it? It's not saying something's true, or there's any evidence, but that someone credible, an unnamed person who's credible or a source, has accused someone of something. I won't spend a lot of time on this one, but it just isn't true. There is some loose connection to something that happened in India, but it isn't at all the same as what's going on, nor what it sounds to be in terms of what this petition is saying. The WHO said, "These rumors are completely false and totally without any scientific basis." See the Africa Check website link for more info in our show notes. In the Snopes piece about Catholic bishops in Kenya asserting that a tetanus vaccine campaign was really a secret effort to sterilize young women, they provided an exchange I'll admit I found amusing. The bishops were saying that women are being rendered infertile by these vaccines. To which, quote, Dr. Collins Tabu, the head of immunization at Kenya's health ministry, refuted the claim and said women immunized under the program in recent years subsequently conceived, prompting Dr. Niger, on the side of the bishops, to respond with, "Either we are lying or the government is lying. But ask yourself, what reason do the Catholic doctors have for lying?" Yeah, when has Catholicism ever been wrong about anything or engaged in deception? Aside from that big assumption that God exists, the cover-up of priests sexually abusing children is one of the most heinous crimes of the past century. Speaking of Catholicism, did the Italian government say that Bill Gates should be arrested? No, thank God. But one member of the Italian parliament did say many critical things about Bill Gates and said that the Italian president, Sergio Mattarella, should refer Gates to the International Criminal Court. Now, just so you know, the International Criminal Court is usually used for dictators that have butchered their own people and other heinous crimes. Italian MP Sarah Cuniel, who is an anti-vaxxer, ranted for about 7 minutes about Gates and vaccines, thankfully while her fellow parliamentarians jeered at her, and the population control thing I just mentioned, and Gates causing COVID-19, and 5G, and on, and nonsense. Nonsense. Okay, so the Italian government calling for arrest is not true, but one member of the government did say something similar. Alright, so that's a partial thing there. But let's move on to this microchipping. In case listeners are curious, I decided I would cover these myths about Bill Gates after I heard about the Italian thing, having already known about that petition. But then I saw a Facebook post referencing a CNET article that had this gem of a headline. Quote, "More than 40% of Republicans think Bill Gates will use COVID-19 vaccine to implant microchips, survey says." End quote. So I read that article wondering what kind of survey this was. As we all know, the questions and how they are framed really does matter. The CNET piece said the representative survey of 1,640 U.S. adults by YouGov for Yahoo News found that half of respondent Americans who say Fox News is their primary television news source believe the conspiracy theory. It's the largest group responding this way, followed by self-described Republicans and voted for Donald Trump in 2016 as another category. 44% of both those groups said they believed the conspiracy theory was true. 26% of respondent Republicans said it was false, and 31% said they weren't sure. All that's a quote from the CNET piece. Okay, but what was the question? I go to the Yahoo News piece about their own survey, find some of the info is repeated, of course, because that's where it came from, and they also state, quote, "In contrast, just 19% of Democrats believe the same spurious narrative about the Microsoft founder and public health philanthropist." When the 19% is contrasted with the 40% or 44%, it seems better. But what? 1 out of 5 Democrats also think Bill Gates is going to secretly implant chips in people? That's not good. That's terrible. Only when I clicked the subtle "The Story Continues" button at the bottom of the article, which is, close to ads, which are very confusing sometimes on these websites, did the article expand a lot with a lot more info, including a detailed chart about the question at hand. So this is what it was. Here are some stories that you may have seen on the internet. Please tell us which of the stories you think are true or false. Bill Gates wants to use a mass vaccination campaign against COVID-19 to implant microchips in people that would be used to track people with a digital ID. Then there's a chart of who said true and false based on whether they watch Fox News, whether they're Republicans, they're Independents, Democrats, or MSNBC, and so on. So it's much worse for anyone who's watching Fox News, but as I said, it's not necessarily that great either. Even for people who would have voted for Hillary Clinton, 12% think it's true. So it's hard to know how much to trust anything, but I think we can be justifiably concerned if even 10% think that Bill Gates wants to plant microchips in people to track them during the administration of a COVID vaccine, which he doesn't have. But that's only if it's false, of course. But I still have to give you some more reasons why it is false. Snopes to the rescue once again. There's a great piece by Alex Kasprak, linked in the show notes, and I'm just going to quote the 3 wonderful paragraphs. From a factual standpoint, Gates has never proposed or funded research into the development of a vaccine for COVID-19 or for anything else that includes the injection of a device that could actively track your location, monitor anything you're doing, or control you. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation did fund a pilot study conducted by MIT and Rice University researchers into a potential vaccine delivery device that could impart an invisible mark detectable by a smartphone. This study was theoretical. The technology described was passive, and the device was incapable of any sort of tracking or monitoring. Still, much of the credence lent to the false notion that Gates has designs to track you with vaccines comes from mixing the existence of that pilot study with another public health concept Gates is actively involved in researching called a digital identity. 2 different things. Continuing with the quote, "The basic premise behind a digital or decentralized identity in the context of Gates' work is simple. It would involve some sort of cloud-based storage of medical and or personal identification documents accessible only with the consent of the owner, but available anywhere in the world. Crucially, such a concept, whose central scientific challenges are in the realm of encryption and blockchains, has nothing to do with anything injected into the body. Despite this, conspiracy theorists falsely use Gates' support for digital identity initiatives as evidence of his intentions to build a vaccine-enabled surveillance state." End quote. ID 2020, which gets funding from the Gates Foundation, wants you to be able to have complete control over your personal health information in cloud storage to make your life easier. Now, you may disagree with that mission, but itself it isn't nefarious. And it's definitely not any more nefarious than anything Google or Facebook is up to. So if you're thinking about this from a global point of view, While many people have relatively accessible health records in the Western world, it's not that easy in other places, especially in poor countries. Wouldn't it be great if it was on the cloud and you could access it through Wi-Fi and only you could access it? That seems like it would be very useful. Now, does Gates believe that we may need something like a health certificate to indicate who has been vaccinated against COVID-19 and who hasn't to enable a greater economic recovery in the future? Yes, it seems like he does. But that is not microchipping people. It's just something close to common sense. If you're imagining people going to restaurants or daycare or whatnot, wouldn't you like to know who's had the vaccine and who hasn't? Even if you have some concerns about this, it is understandable other people might want such a thing, and there can be a healthy public debate about what's valid and reasonable. But I could see there's good arguments on both sides. Say you agree with that, but you might still think, doesn't Microsoft have some sort of microchip patent? Well, Microsoft published a patent for a cryptocurrency system that focuses on tracking body activity via wearables technology like smartwatches. Nothing about implanting microchips. And also note the patent number isn't 666. People just come up with this stuff all over the place. And these terrible conspiracies are just the main ones about Gates. They're not true. And there's more that aren't true all over the internets. I asked originally if Gates was evil, because many seem to believe Gates has nefarious plans to either microchip or make infertile large parts of humanity. These are nonsense claims. To be fair, though, if you happen to think capitalism is evil, then you might think Gates is also evil just because he has clearly succeeded in America's capitalist system. Was Gates arrogant and awkward as Microsoft sought to monopolize control of the software market by almost any means necessary? Yes, he was. Has he since decided to give away pretty much all his money and spends most of his time concerned about public health and people dying from disease? Yes, he does. Is the Gates Foundation terrible because they chose to fund a program A and say not B? Well, that's debatable. They have about 400 people working there with top advisors in the world, and they may not get their funding allocations perfectly correct, but I'm sure they have reasons, and I haven't seen anyone do anything perfectly. Similarly, should the Gates Foundation be criticized for investing in companies that cause harm in the very communities they are trying to help? This is debatable for various reasons, but some of which are that Gates believes in both maximizing return, because then you can donate more money to fund more initiatives which are positive, but also you might have more sway as a shareholder to change practices. It's the idea of can you reform something from the inside or the out. As a general point, we know people seek to confirm beliefs they already have, so if someone thinks the worst of Bill Gates, they will always reach that conclusion. And the opposite is true too, but none of the terrible accusations I just covered were true. So here's the thought experiment I came up with. Play along at home. Gates understands the science to know that vaccines are important and save lives. There are many vaccines for many diseases, but not for all diseases. Reminder that the Gates Foundation does not make or administer vaccines, but theoretically, imagine there's a poor African country that suffers more from disease X than any Western country. In science, we would want a controlled experiment with a treatment group getting the vaccine and a control group getting a sham or non-vaccine to see if the vaccine is effective. It would also make sense to do this experiment on the population that the vaccine is intended for. So, in this thought experiment of a reasonable approach, can you imagine the headline? Gates tests vaccine on poor Africans. But in this example, that's exactly what should be done. Now, alternatively, assuming Gates understands the political sensitivities, perhaps he thinks, you know what, I don't want that flack. It's probably better and more prudent to fund an organization that will test the vaccine on Western people, perhaps American university students, because they're often the ones who get tested for these things. Let's imagine they would expose them to the virus and then simulate the environment to see if the vaccine works. What could be the headline? Gates develops vaccines for Americans, ignores Africans who are suffering more. Perhaps there would even be charges of racism because Gates is not appropriately addressing the different African countries' local context about who would actually get the vaccine, and they're testing it on, say, white university students versus the people who actually need it. This is like a lose-lose. And yet, Gates keeps going. His foundation has given $300 million to fight COVID-19. Gates also gave a TED Talk 5 years ago where he tried to warn everyone about the pandemic. He also warned Trump when Trump became president of the United States for the potential harm of a virus and saying something should be done about that. And Gates currently says he wishes he had done more. That Yahoo survey about the absurd belief that Gates was implanting microchips that I mentioned earlier was done by YouGov, but they also did another one about the most admirable man and woman in the world and in each country. Now, it isn't a fill in the blank, but choose from among a set after people have responded about what they think. So in those surveys, Bill Gates is actually the most admired man in the world, and has been for years. How odd life must be for Bill Gates, to have people believe such things about you. You're the most admired man in the world, and then you're secretly trying to kill people and reduce their fertility and microchip people? Now, Gates has criticized the Trump administration's response to COVID-19, so now the right-wing propaganda machine happily supports these preposterous conspiracy theories, no doubt inadvertently aided by Russian trolls looking to increase division and hostility. But let's come back to the original question. Is Bill Gates evil? Look at the main accusations. Vaccines to depopulate people in general? No. Tetanus vaccines to make people infertile? No. Italian government wants him arrested? No. Plans to microchip people? No. Holds a patent to microchip people? No. Gates Foundation does bad things? No, or debatable at best. So not only is Gates not evil, he seems to be trying to do the most good with his time and money, which is a lot more than many of his fellow billionaires can say, and definitely more than the muckraking conspiracy theorists whose false beliefs literally likely cause people to suffer and die. So after all this, I think I can say that while each claim should be investigated, of course, we can use heuristics to navigate the world until we have time to do the research to investigate each claim. And I think now that anytime I hear something negative about Gates and the Gates Foundation, my provisional assumption will be, that's not true. Until next time, think better to act better.
What's up, Cuboids? I've been into anime since people called it Japanese animation or Japanime back in the 90s, and over the years, one thing I've often heard from people was, why do anime characters all look white? Now, I will not seek to answer this question directly, but perhaps answer the related question, why do white people think anime characters look white? Now, there are a lot of angles to this question, and it's about art, so there won't be any definitive answers, but I just wanted to take a look at the idea and some of the options on why it might seem that anime characters look white. So we're clear what's being discussed here when I talk about anime is that I am simply speaking about animated television programs and movies made in Japan. One way to look at the issue is simply that anime characters aren't meant to be white, but they simply don't have exaggerated Asian, in this case Japanese, traits, so a non-Japanese viewer thinks the characters just look like people, and therefore assume them to be white. It's important to understand that a Japanese viewer does not think an anime character is white, but considers that character to be Japanese. A Japanese word, mukokuseki, helps illustrate this idea. The word translates to stateless, meaning without any nationality. It is used to describe when a drawn character has no ethnic features. So basically, an anime character may be drawn with the intention to have no specific ethnic traits and therefore be assumed to be white by a white audience. I find this answer mostly convincing, but I think there's a bit more to the whole idea than that. Faithful listeners will know that I am a huge Sailor Moon fan, and this show is one that people often point to as an example of white people in anime. There are a lot of characters in this show and they all have different hair colors. If they were all meant to resemble the typical look of Japanese teenagers, they would mostly have straight black or dark brown hair and dark brown eyes, but anyone familiar with this show knows that this is not at all the case. The core group of girls has Sailor Moon, blonde with blue eyes, Sailor Mercury, blue hair and blue eyes, Sailor Mars, a very typical Japanese-looking character with black hair and purple eyes, Sailor Jupiter with wavy brown hair and green eyes, and Sailor Venus, who, like Sailor Moon, has blonde hair with blue eyes, and that similarity is somewhat intentional. There's a lot to get into with that. So what's going on here? Why is Sailor Moon white? Because only white people have blonde hair and blue eyes, right? Well, Sailor Moon, along with her friends, is Japanese. She has a Japanese name. She lives in the Juban district of Tokyo in Japan. She's actually from the moon, and her friends all come from other planets, and they're reincarnated as Japanese people, but that's not really mentioned as being a factor in their hair or eye color. Her parents, Ikuko and Kenji, have dark hair, blue and black respectively, while her brother Shingo has brown hair. And these characters are named after the author's family, and the author is Japanese. Originally, the Sailor V manga featured Mineko, Sailor Venus, and so this blonde, blue-eyed character had similar-looking parents, and this was sort of remade / spun off into a Sailor Moon comic, which became a worldwide sensation, hence the similar hair and eye color. Now, there's a whole lot more that I could say about that, but we don't really have time to talk for an hour about the Sailor V comic on this podcast. Now, Sailor Moon's daughter has pink hair, and that doesn't exist in the real world. People don't really have blue hair either, so that seems to be close enough to black. The excellent live-action Sailor Moon series from 2003 did not cast a white actress as Sailor Moon, but had a black-haired Japanese actress in the role. All of the main characters were Japanese, and they simply wore wigs when they transformed. Now, this is just one example, but it's a very popular example. But this is very common, especially in fantasy or science fiction anime, where no specific ethnicity is intended for the characters. This is not universal, of course, and many anime series will have all dark-haired characters, reserving blonde hair and blue eyes for European or Western characters. What people are often referring to when they say anime characters look white isn't necessarily hair or eye color, but that anime eyes don't look Asian to them. And it's about what's called the epicanthic fold. It's a skin fold in the upper eyelid, and there are actually a few variations which depend on specific ethnicity, and this makes for a slightly different eye shape in some ethnic groups. White people sometimes don't have this fold, so instead they will have a crease on the upper eyelid, and this makes white people's eyes and the eyes of some other ethnic groups appear to be larger. Most people's eyeballs are actually the same size. That's not really what's going on here. People don't have huge eyeballs in certain ethnic groups. The epicanthic fold simply makes the eyes appear narrower to some people. People tend to notice this feature more in other ethnic groups besides their own. Anime characters sometimes have a crease in their upper eyelid, suggesting that they don't actually have an epicanthic fold. If you look very closely at Sailor Moon's eyes, you will see such a crease, but it's often hard to see this, and not all anime characters have that specific line. But this isn't what makes her eyes seem big. It's that they're literally cartoonishly huge. Anime characters usually have extremely exaggerated facial features with big eyes, a small nose, and small mouths. This is not at all limited to anime characters, but that's the topic at hand. They are cute type features common in babies and children. These are juvenile traits in animated characters, and it makes them appealing. There's no real mystery here. When comparing the minor differences in actual human eyes, the differences are minuscule, but anime eyes are in a whole other league. Similarly, Western animation is full of exaggerated juvenile features which aren't close to real proportions. The actual shape of anime eyes compared to those in Western animation vary quite a bit, but all of them are huge compared to real eyes, for the most part. Now, when it comes to beauty standards, large eyes, mostly in women, are often seen as attractive, and this can be seen in models and actresses in Japan and elsewhere in the world. Again, this comes down to neoteny or juvenilization. Women have neotenous features compared to men, so larger eyes becomes a feminine trait. Ultimately, there are a lot of factors at play in the art styles common in today's anime, and of course this is not universal, as anime art styles vary as much as cartoons anywhere. If you look at older Japanese art, those characters do look distinctly Japanese, at least compared to modern anime. So, what happened here? The designs by Osamu Tezuka, who created Astro Boy in the 1950s, and other famous characters, were likely inspired by Walt Disney and other American animators. These iconic early manga and anime characters inspired other anime and manga characters which followed. Anime and manga styles throughout the years would evolve, but they would keep a similar core aesthetic. Now, anime is a varied art form. There are certainly some series and movies in which people think characters look Japanese. Akira is one example of this, though there are a lot of others, and they are too numerous to mention. Like I said, anime is an art form. There are many different art styles, and audiences perceive those based on what they are familiar with themselves. White people may sometimes think that anime characters look white, but Japanese people think of them as Japanese. Exaggerated juvenile facial features and varied hair and eye color make some audiences perceive these characters as white, while this is often not the intention. I've tried to give a few explanations for why this illusion may be occurring, and there are surely other aspects which I may not be touching on. Art and culture are complex and full of a variety of influences. Peace out, cuboids.
For show notes or to discuss this episode, visit our Facebook page and website at trcpodcast.com. For general inquiries or to send a topic or parody suggestion, email info@trcpodcast.com. Help support the show by leaving a review on iTunes and liking us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter at @TRC_podcast.